So, as it turns out, in a moment of pure coincidence, my son's art class has given him an assignment for the end of the year, which is very similar to ours, which is to build a board game. So, he has to design his own game with the board, any pieces or other accessories that go along with that. And I thought that it was certainly very fitting for our class that he has to do that as we are developing our own board games or games of any kind really for the end of the year. And I thought one of the things that I thought was a good thing for us to do was to kind of act like a fourth grader. When we're developing our games, it's a good idea to kind of get in that mindset of what a younger person might think about, or at least the attitude that they bring to the table when it comes to just designing a game. Because it is about fun. It's about seeing how to make the game turn out the best as possible without getting in our own way in a lot of ways. So, first of all, the assignment, because it's always a good idea to start with the assignment to look over what is expected and what the rules are so that we can then develop a game that meets all the requirements. And so, for this assignment, he was assigned to create a board game for art class. So, for his version of the game, it was perhaps not meant to be fully thought out and developed like ours are going to be. So, it had to be, designed and creative and all that, but he probably didn't have to spend quite as much time on the rules and the structure that we're being asked to put into our projects. Um, but at the same time, uh, knowing my son is to know that he's a detailed person and he likes to um, break things down and figure out how it all works and put everything into it. So certainly his game is going to be more on par with what we would be doing for our class. So as he started coming up with ideas anyway, his first one was to create a game based on the Alien movie series. I think I mentioned this in class before, that last summer um, I felt that he was old enough and mature enough to handle watching the Alien movies, and perhaps that was a mistake on my part because now he's obsessed with them, and everything's about Alien. So that was his first idea, and then he asked his teacher if he could make a pinball machine, and got permission actually to create a pinball machine as his game, and so that was something thrown out there that we had to talk about. And basically, the constraints of the assignment were that it had to be done in 2 weeks. So it has to be done by this Friday, actually. So it really kind of came down to where do we go from here? And so first, we looked at a few issues. And as you can imagine, even without me saying so, there were a few issues here. First of all, Alien is not necessarily appropriate for the audience. He is only in fourth grade. Alien is not necessarily a school appropriate series. There's certainly language and blood and guts and gore and all of that involved. Um, Not all parents are comfortable with their children, um, you know, watching this type of material, and so we have to be careful about who we're exposing the game to. And so this is supposedly going to be visible to his classmates, and so with that, he's probably it's probably not a good idea for him to create a game based off of this um, this subject matter. So after that, he was like, okay, well, I want to create that pinball machine, and the question is, can it be done in time? I mean, my son is mechanically inclined, and he builds stuff all the time. So is it possible for him to make a pinball game? Yes. But could it be done in the amount of time he had? Likely no. So he's actually going to continue this idea and try and build his own version over the summer. But for an assignment due within 2 weeks of starting, a pinball machine is not likely to happen. And as you can imagine, lots of stress and lots of tears came after. Um, my my son is pretty sensitive, and so he didn't like the idea of having his first two ideas shot down. We tried to be as gentle as possible about it, of course, but the two ideas he had, um, all we could see is them adding more stress trying to get it all done uh, in the appropriate amount of time. And I can understand that because it's easy to get hung up on a single idea and see no other option. It's easy to get that tunnel vision, um, and it's good because if you're passionate, it gives you focus. But at the same time, um, if you get stuck on one idea and think that that's the only way to go, it prevents you from being open to other ideas. So one of the tricks is you need to balance your complexity with what you can get done. So, um, it's one thing to have great ideas, but it's another to be realistic. Um, so when developing a game like this particular assignment that my son had, you know, if you only have 2 weeks to develop a game from start to finish, you got to kind of keep it grounded a bit so that you can get done what you need to get done in the time you have. And that's true for you guys too. Right now we have about 2 weeks left to develop these games, but um, that's plenty of time to do it. But it's at the same time, you have to recognize your limitations and not try and do something that is far too advanced for what you're capable of accomplishing in that amount of time. So where did we go? We had to come up with an idea. And so we started talking about what it is that he likes, what subjects, what themes. And so his head was still in this, alien kind of mindset where he wanted to come up with something based on like a show or a movie, which is not a bad idea. And so, as you can see from the background, if you're not familiar, this is in fact the Simpsons house. And so he loves the Simpsons. He's about 9 seasons in and he's seen the movie. And so we decided to go with the Simpsons. And one of the benefits of using a series or a defined theme is that you have your mood board already there for you. It's all been created um, from the start. You have, a sense of the color scheme and the overall look and the feel because it's been well established over 30 seasons. You know the characters, the locations, the situations that are possible. So you can already have this idea of how to develop everything for you. So once you already have that, you've come up with the idea, you've come up with your mood board. It's how's the game going to work? What's the structure going to look like? Um, how are the rules going to kind of play themselves out? All of that stuff. And so we figured out a few things. We did a lot of brainstorming, a lot of trial and error. He's in 4th grade, so he's capable of coming up with a lot of this stuff on his own, and I kind of help guide him a little bit with what makes the most sense, what would work and what wouldn't. And through that, we came up with some initial ideas that he came up with. So he thought there should be player-specific situation cards to tell the characters what to do. So um, each of the characters, basically the family of 5 that is the Simpsons, would each have their own set of cards so that when they arrived at a certain location, they would look at their card and it would tell them what they needed to do. So if like Bart got to the school, he'd flip over his school card and it would say that, he was skipping school and he had to move forward to the Springfield Gorge or something like that. Or Homer gets to work, he lands at the power plant and maybe he falls asleep on the job and gets caught by Mr. Burns, and so he loses a turn or something like that. He also thought about having money involved, so it's kind of like a Monopoly game where everybody starts off with a set amount of money. You go to school, maybe Bart broke a window and you have to pay to fix it. Homer goes to Moe's and loses $100. Um, you know, they go to the comic book store and spend money. Marge goes to the Quickie Mart, that kind of thing. And so you get money, you lose money as you went. But um, there were some other issues there that we had to factor in because obviously Maggie is a baby and doesn't necessarily interact with money all that much. So it wouldn't make sense for her to spend or lose money or make money. And so it really became overly complicated really quickly. And so one of the things we need to be aware of is that um, what we're creating needs to be something that is complex, in that there is a lot going on that keeps it interesting, but you don't want it to be complicated. There's a very important difference between being complex and being complicated. Because if it's complicated, it means it's hard to understand, it's hard to follow, it's confusing, it's going to make your players um, maybe get tired of trying, and so they're not going to want to play. And also, you can't always fit everything into a single game. It's always easy to come up with lots and lots of ideas, but you can't always make them all work together. And so a lot of the initial ideas were actually set aside, but then they turned into something that actually seems to work. So we worked out some kinks. Grabbed a piece of paper and a colored pencil and just started drawing out a map of Springfield. We didn't worry about what things actually looked like as far as houses and locations go, but we kind of put placeholders in there, just words and circles. And so they'd all start at the Simpsons house, and they'd make their way around. They'd go to school, and the power plant, and Quickie Mart, and there's Krusty Burger in there. There's the comic book store and Moe's Tavern. There's the music store, the church. All the different kind of key locations from the show were part of it. Um, and we decided that instead of having individual character cards so that you would know, every time you played that Lisa was going to have a certain handful of things happen to her, we decided to have more generic cards. So like if you're at the school, it's not just like, you know, Lisa won first place in the science fair, and so she gets to move forward 2 spaces. It's oh, there's a PTA meeting, and so you lose a turn, or you get to the Quickie Mart and you get stuck behind Hans Moleman. So if you know the show at all, he's kind of this really slow old guy who's really kind of sad, but if you get stuck behind him in line, you have to lose a turn. So it depends. Doesn't matter who you are, you can play the card easily based on the location instead of it being so character specific. We also decided that, to make it more interesting, we'd have spots along the way where if you happen to land on a space, it would tell you what to do, whether to move forward or go backwards or move a turn or roll again or something like that, just to kind of keep things moving and interesting. And it kind of adds variety as well. And so we just kind of, scribbled this out. All the numbers on there we decided how many spaces we were actually going to use instead of just drawing out like, placeholders, so that when we got to the actual board design, we could measure things out, make sure it all lined up. And so what we did was we started creating rules from our initial drawing. And so we decided that there were going to be up to 4 players. We started off thinking about 5 when we were talking about money. We decided to switch it to 4, but then we did away with the idea of money. So it ended up just being 4 players. We could introduce Maggie back in there if we wanted to. It's flexible enough. But we decided 4 players, and Maggie's kind of like connected with Marge, so like she's carrying him throughout the game. You'd roll a die, and whoever gets the highest number would go first. And then you would use the die to essentially move around the board on each turn. And then you'd further move around the board based on instructions on the spaces and location cards. 5 different locations around the board, 5 or 6, I think. Different locations would have cards associated with them, and you'd have to pick up a card to tell you what came next. Some of the cards would help, some would hinder, and some would affect some of the other players as well. So this is where the idea of advantages and disadvantages comes in. And also we decided to add a little bit of interest in doing something that might hurt another player or help another player as well, kind of like Uno, which is a favorite game of ours to play, where you can skip or reverse or make somebody draw 4. We kind of like the kind of devious nature of it, and so we wanted to put a little piece of that in the game as well. So if you show up at the comic book store, for example, one of the cards is that um, you need to borrow money from Lisa in order to purchase something that's really expensive. I think it was a frame from an original Itchy and Scratchy cartoon. And so no matter where Lisa is on the board, you can pick her up and move her to your spot at the comic book store. Or there's another one where you're at Moe's Tavern and you need to get taken home, and so you can choose any other character to come basically pick you up, and so that person can come to your spot, and for their trouble they get to roll twice on their next turn and move double the spaces or something like that. So we had some other things like that to help other players to make it more interesting, not just strictly wandering around the board. And of course, you have to know how to win. And so if you start at home, you have to return to the Simpsons house to win. So we took that initial sketch and we started drawing our board. Here is where it stands as of today. We still have some more that we're going to be doing to it. But we took the initial sketch and we drew it out. My own sense of I don't know what the word would be, but my sense of needing to have things nice and tidy and lined up, I took charge of this portion of the design so that everything would be straight and equal, so that each of those squares is actually 1 inch by 1 inch. And so we placed our objects around the corners, significant locations. We ended up creating some cards. Oops, did I skip that? No, we're going to get to that part. So we created some cards. My son is drawing out all of the different locations right now. We decided to draw them separately, and then we would use some rubber cement to attach them to the poster board because it's hard to fix drawing on the poster board. So I figured if he made mistakes or anything, he could do that first and we can attach it later. So here's the Simpsons house. The paper's a little curled, but it'll be flat once we attach it. We also made some cards just out of regular paper and printed on both sides. And one of the benefits here is I taught him how to use some Photoshop here and there over the course of the last couple of months. And so he actually got to help out with getting these created. I just did some initial layout for him. And so we worked together on those. He created the characters, the actual game pieces, did all the drawings for those. I would have probably created these a little differently if it was my game, but after all, it is his project, so it's up to him to decide. And so he has these that will move around the board. And so what comes next, of course, after you've done your initial work, is to put some finishing touches on your game. So you want to add details and refine the look and feel of the game. So we're going to be tracing around the different spaces. We're going to be attaching all the pieces. Any blank areas around the board are going to get filled in. He's going to draw trees and grass and stuff like that to make it more interesting. We're definitely going to be doing some play testing. So my kids and my wife and I will be playing the game, seeing what works, what might not. And with that, of course, means taking notes. We're going to try and remember through the notes, not just through our own memories, but by writing them down, what parts worked, what didn't, where were there frustrations, where were the parts where the game kind of slowed down and got boring at times, or what seemed to go by too fast and we want to spend more time with it, and then use that to make some improvements. That's why it's so important, and is a big part of the grade for the project, is to take notes based on the feedback you get from playtesters so that you can actually make changes. You don't want to just have playtesters and get feedback for the sake of getting feedback. You actually want to make your game as good as it can be. So who knows where this is going to end up. Hopefully we'll have everything buttoned up and finished by Friday so that he can turn that in. I think it's going to turn out better this way than initially planned, because it's a much more directed and focused concept. It's also one that uses skills that he has. We're trying to avoid getting it too complicated for what he can actually accomplish in the time he has. And also we were trying to keep it simple but still fun, because you don't want to make it too overly complicated or involved and try and put every idea in there, because at that point it feels forced. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten a new board game where it looked like it would be fun, and you get to the rules and it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. If you can't easily remember the rules and play along, then it quickly becomes something that loses its appeal. So as you're working on your projects, remember that this process is the same, whether you're in 4th grade, 11th, or 12th. Whether you're creating a board game, a card game, any other tabletop game, or a video game of some kind, the process remains the same. It's a way to stay organized. It's a way to make sure that your work is clear and concise and efficient, and your end product will be well thought out and well developed. Everything in this process is essentially the same except for development. If you're building a board game or a card game, you're doing more physical creation as opposed to the digital creation you would be using for an electronic game of some kind. Coding and drawing are two totally different skill sets, but you still need to have the concept, the mood board, the rules, the initial setup of how the game is meant to be played, and the testing and feedback purposes. I have a question here, if it's okay to use a theme from a show or movie for a game and make it my own. And the answer, I would say, is yes. Inspiration certainly comes from all sorts of different directions and different sources. I think that when you find something that sparks an idea, to run with it. A difference here between what we're doing in class versus if you were out, making a game in the real world to develop and sell, is the issue of copyright, for sure. Obviously, if we were to try and sell this game, we would quickly run into a lot of pushback legally from Disney, because Disney owns The Simpsons, and so we wouldn't be able to use this without buying licensing for the game and get the rights to use it. So there's that aspect of it. But because this is an educational purpose for personal use, you're not going to be selling it or disseminating it anyway. There shouldn't be any issue with creating it for the purposes of the class, or even for, once you develop it, you want to use it at home, you're not monetizing it at all, then you should be fine. But yeah, I definitely think that finding your inspiration from wherever is good. Whatever strikes you as being a meaningful and effective resource, I think is great. I would just, as you said here, make it your own. Make it so that it will give you a certain sense of ownership. I think I always do my best work when I find pride in my work, and when I also am doing something I care about. And so if you make it your own, then you're going to, and it's something that you enjoy, you're going to make it even better than something that feels forced, for sure. So we have 2 weeks left until these projects are due. And I encourage you all to continue your work on those and do the best you can. As I said, tomorrow is going to be a required set of office hours. So anytime between 2 and 3 o'clock for the afternoon, or 11 and 12 for the morning class, anytime you want to log in during your class time is fine. I'll be there for the whole hour. But I'd like to hear from everybody about what your project is, what type of game you're creating, what the theme is going to be, where you're at in your process, any questions or roadblocks you might have run into to help get you finished. And that way I can make sure you're on the right track for having it ready for next week. Last thing is that we are going to be um, focusing on these games, and so there are no additional assignments beyond working on your final project. We'll still be having our class sessions on a regular schedule, talking about different aspects of the game, but I would like for you to focus your attention on getting those games finished.